Hey everybody, welcome to Reimagining the Internet. My name's Ethan Zuckerman. I'm here today with Nathan Schneider. He's an assistant professor of media studies at the University of Colorado Boulder, where he leads the Media Enterprise Design Lab. Nathan organized the first platform cooperativism conference with Trevor Schultz in 2015. He wrote an excellent book in 2018, Everything for Everyone, the radical tradition that is shaping the next economy, which I think is probably the best explainer out there of platform cooperatives. It's actually one of 4 books he's written, including books about the Occupy movement and about searches for the proof of existence or non-existence of God. Nathan is just a fascinating and broad-based thinker, and I'm really looking forward to the conversation we're going to have today about platform co-ops and everything that comes after. Welcome. Nice to have you here.
Thank you. It's so good to be here.
So, Nathan, we've talked a bit with your colleague Trevor Schutz about platform cooperatives, but we're going to be talking today about some of the problems, how these systems scale, what it might mean to exit to community, which is an idea that you've been writing and thinking about. Start us off simple. What do you mean when you talk about platform cooperativism?
To me, it's really about the challenge of bringing an old legacy of cooperative enterprise, of shared ownership in the economies that people participate in by those participants into the online economy. And, it seems like this is the sort of thing that the online economy might have been built from to begin with, right? We have peer production, we have open source software, and we have democratized access to information. And yet, in a lot of ways, the internet has produced some of the most centralized forms of investor ownership the world has ever seen. Some of the largest companies the world has ever seen. The incredible concentrations of power. And the platform cooperativism is an attempt to kind of connect this sense of possibility that people have had around the internet with this old legacy of people actually doing that kind of shared ownership all the way down into the level of companies that has existed outside of it. For instance, in the agricultural sector, and my grandfather ran a hardware distribution cooperative that enabled small hardware stores to thrive. This is a model that has operated all around the world, and it's something that I think helps address a lot of the challenges that we see in the online economy, as well as like the general malaise of democracy in general. So I think of it as in some ways a kind of response to particular ills of on the internet, but also a much broader response to a much broader vision for the kind of future we want.
So 2 things to unpack there. So first, sort of wrestling with what we might think of as Bankler's paradox, right? We have all these visions for how the internet is going to give us these open participatory systems. We have all these new modes of production that give us remarkable things like Linux and Wikipedia, but somehow the dominant economic model that emerges is one of intense concentration. We have companies like Facebook and Google, which I guess are now Meta and Alphabet, something about these very powerful companies changing their names, that really have almost unprecedented knowledge about the world, about their customers, that they are then going off and selling to other people. So somehow, despite having what we thought were the right rules in place, perhaps we got the economics wrong. Maybe the technology was right, the economics were wrong. The second thing is that platform co-ops, as you're reminding us, first of all, are a real thing. There are co-ops out in the world. If you go to an Ace Hardware store, you are interacting with a co-op. The employees and the store owners are owners of Ace as a whole. But also platform co-ops are a thing. Talk about some of the examples of platform co-ops that are real working things out in the world.
Absolutely. Yeah, they take a lot of different forms, and it's important to see this as, I think, a movement more than a particular model. So, you've got examples like in New York City, prominent example recently has been the Drivers Cooperative, which is the kind of driver-owned Uber, right? A kind of holy grail in this space. And then you also have data cooperatives like two examples I think are really instructive are MeData in Switzerland, which is a kind of personal medical data repository where members can't monetize their own data, but they can share it for research use. And then in the U.S., we have one called Savvy, which is a little different in that it's a co-op of patients, often with chronic illnesses, who are doing gigs, providing their knowledge and understanding of their conditions to companies that are trying to produce products for them on their own terms, using their collective power, and they're actually making money. So the models can really be quite divergent, as the cooperative tradition more broadly has been. But what they all have in common is that sense of collective power, that sense that the participants who are creating the value also own the value that they create.
So let's go for a little bit on what you described as the holy grail for platform co-ops, which is ousting Uber, right? So Uber essentially provides two pieces of software. It provides a piece of software that allows passengers to find a driver, and then it provides a piece of software that allows drivers to find passengers. And in exchange for those services, it takes a good chunk of the driver's revenue. And many people have seen Uber as sort of a sign of a particularly predatory economic model in which venture capital money is used to subsidize market position, but the fundamental business proposition is not a winning one for the participants. There's a perception, I think that's becoming increasingly demonstrable, that drivers can't actually make a living off of Uber, and that Uber in some ways is sort of based on false premises. How does putting Uber in the hands of the driver change that equation? What does the platform co-op do differently than how Uber does it?
Well, Uber is, I called it the Holy Grail because it represents in some respects what excited a lot of people about this idea of a sharing economy, right? One in which more peer-to-peer connections would be possible through technology, and that this could be, liberating and maybe environmentally helpful. Uber turns out not to be so much, but but then the difference is that ownership structure. And in fact, I don't think of Uber. Uber likes to talk about itself as a tech company, a logistics company, everything but a employer. But I really think of it as primarily, a regulatory arbitrage company, because its technology is widely replicated. You can buy an off-the-shelf copy of Uber software, for almost nothing. But what you can't replicate is the network effects, the power of the company, especially in its ability to manipulate regulatory environments in its favor. And that's the real difference. And what the co-op models try to do is try to put that same kind of relatively commodity software into the hands of drivers. Though we have to recognize they are up against a lot. For instance, really important case that reveals this regulatory arbitrage side is that a number of years ago, Austin required Uber and Lyft to fingerprint drivers, the same things that taxi drivers have to do, safety, and the companies refused to do that because they didn't want to do that everywhere else. So they left. And the city helped facilitate the development of a nonprofit rideshare and a taxi co-op, and they worked great. I mean, I remember going to Austin during the time when those were running or when they were really thriving, and it was fine. It was cheaper. The drivers loved it. They paid a lot less in commissions. It was just a really nice deal for them. It actually turns out that this model works better when it's scaled locally. And we're seeing that also with food delivery, which I can get into.
Well, but tell the end of the Austin story. So what happens to that? Does Uber come back? Does that co-op thrive? Is it part of keeping Austin weird or whatever it is supposed to be these days? How does that story end?
It's a regulatory story. What happens is that the government, the state government in Austin, with the support, for instance, of the College of Republicans at UT, ends up overruling the city of Austin's decision and preventing the city from having these kinds of rules. And Uber and Lyft come back, and because of their network effects, their brand power, their ability to subsidize, they're able to regain their market share. And so there you see the sense in which these monopolies are really protected and enabled, not so much just by the glory of their technology, but by their market power and their ability to manipulate the regulatory environment.
Right. And let's just unpack that for a second. So just to be clear, Uber, when it started working in New York City, didn't have to buy taxi medallions. It didn't have to, get licensed yellow cabs. It didn't have to put their taxi drivers through all the steps that licensed New York City taxi drivers go through. In the process, coming in, undercutting rates, or in some cases not even undercutting rates, simply adding a level of convenience from payment and hailing through the app, managed to severely damage the New York cab business, hurting lots of individual cab drivers as well as people who had invested, in some cases, life savings into their cabs. A regulatory environment was supposed to protect the taxi cab business. It failed in this case, in part because Uber has been very aggressive in mobilizing its users, for one thing, on behalf of making arguments to city government. So why are platform cooperatives sort of losing in a case like that, right? So it sounds like the city of Austin sort of stepped in, created this perfect opportunity for a platform cooperative, which you said the riders and the drivers both liked, but it ended up losing out to scale, right? It ended up losing out to people like me who aren't in Austin often, come in for South by Southwest. I've already got Lyft installed on my phone, and so I end up using that rather than the platform cooperative. How do platform cooperatives scale to compete with the Ubers and the Lyfts of the world?
So this is really essential, and it goes back. I mean, this is a story about the kinds of innovation, the ways in which we have decided as a society to enable innovation. For instance, venture capital is often treated as a kind of force of nature in our discourse. Venture capital was not itself able to scale until Congress allowed it to by passing a law that changed the prudent man rule and changed the ability for pension funds to invest in venture capital and to unleash the floodgates. We have to recognize that we have a society that has systematically decided to support investor ownership as the means of innovation rather than other approaches. When groups of people like, for instance, the taxi cooperative form, they do not have anything like comparable access to capital. And that's not just, again, a natural, a kind of state of nature phenomenon. That is a result of the financing environment that our society has created.
What's the solution to that? How do we solve the problem of platform co-ops or anyone else who wants to innovate in a technological sense outside of investor ownership? What are the other paradigms? What are the structures we need to make that innovation possible?
Well, the kind of exciting thing for geeks of history of this stuff is that we've done it a bunch of times. So we've done it in very specific sectors. So like credit unions, like a good chunk of people in the United States have their deposits in credit unions. I have a mortgage with a credit union. It's a very common thing. It's the largest lender in my area, and that was enabled through legislation, particularly in the early 30s. The rural electrification problem, in the mid 30s, half of the United States, 90% of rural America was not didn't have access to electricity. The solution to that the Roosevelt administration led was to enable financing through the Department of Agriculture for rural electric cooperatives, and it solved the problem in around a decade. And we still have a revenue positive loan fund at the Department of Agriculture. The problem is every time we do co-op or shared ownership legislation, we put it in a straitjacket. We've enabled investors to be creative, to do whatever they want. But when we talk about co-ops, we say, you can only do this one thing. You have to follow this cookie cutter. We don't trust you. We don't want to unleash you in the economy. So what we need is a framework that unleashes shared ownership on the economy as a creative force, not simply a stopgap for particular little hitches, market failures, right? Where investors fail to solve a certain kind of problem.
Okay, so I'm with you so far. We need a general structure, not specific to this particular problem or that particular problem. It needs to be somehow outside of the venture capital system, which you rightly pointed out. I talk with Mal Sauter often about this, is a very particular product of pension funds being able to make incredibly risky investments, but sort of turning that risk into the mainstream of investing. What's the solution that's going to unlock this pool of capital for creative solutions that allow us to be more pro-social and more focused on how we imagine and build these futures?
I think there are a few approaches and also some new ones coming online. But, in the kind of 20th century economy, you could imagine something like Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, a public insurance pool that sits there and makes sure, that those were the pools that we use to enable home ownership, unfortunately along very racist and exclusionary lines, but still more widespread home ownership through a pool that incentivized the private sector to actually recognize that lending to regular working people to buy homes was a reasonable thing. And now nobody questions it. If we had similar pools to support shared ownership investments, recognizing that this is a public good, I think we'd end up with a situation quite similar, where suddenly, when a neighborhood in a city or a region in a rural area doesn't have broadband internet, they can just go to the bank and buy something, get a loan to build something that they can co-own, and nobody would bat an eye. Right now, of course, we can't do that. Those communities are waiting for investors to decide that those people have value like anybody else. And that's one approach. We're also seeing, for instance, my senator, John Hickenlooper, recently proposed something finally requiring the Small Business Administration to lend to cooperatives like they do to other businesses. But one way or another, I think we need probably a few different mechanisms. But we need to have a recognition that shared ownership is a vehicle for wealth creation and equity, and that this is something, and also for innovation, for technology, this is a vehicle for ensuring accountability for the power that technology gives us, and we need to enable that.
So those are, I would say that the Hickenlooper Small Business Administration is a partial solution. The sort of Freddie Mac style pool of capital that communities, groups can go to fund something like broadband, but of course not just limited to broadband, to fund whatever seems appropriate, whether it's local wind power or whether it's putting your electric infrastructure under the ground.
Or a group of employees buying out their employer.
Right. Because of course it doesn't have to be municipal. It can be on the level of any sort of group organizing to do it. How does this relate to what you're writing about now with this idea of exit to community?
Yeah. So after working on platform cooperativism for years, I was realizing, okay, first of all, we're attracting only the people who, already know what a cooperative is and want to do that from the beginning. And second of all, sometimes it doesn't make sense to do the shared ownership from the very beginning. And so exit to community was an attempt to bring some of these ideas into the startup community as it is, where if you're a normal person, exit is like a sign on the wall, right? But if you're in startups, exit is your whole purpose. The whole point of a startup is to exit, which means to essentially sell the company to either an acquiring company or on a stock exchange as an IPO. In either case, you're just handing it off to another set of investors. And what I and my collaborators have been arguing is that we need another option where community ownership becomes the destination that startups aspire towards. So maybe early on, it would be closely held by its founders, maybe some investors who help get it going, help find the market, help find that community. But then at the point where it matures, the startup starts converting toward community ownership, and that can look a lot of different ways. It could mean users buying it from the founders, and the founders get a return from that. It could mean a kind of token sale. It could mean a kind of federation approach. We've mapped out a few different strategies. Really, what this is, though, is a different kind of story about what startups are for and what we expect of them.
How is an exit to community different from going public? If I'm a big fan of Facebook and I'm a heavy user of it, and Facebook goes public, there's very little that stops me from going to my stockbroker and buying shares of Facebook, so long as I've got the money to do it. How is exit to community different from going public on the stock exchange and allowing the company's biggest fans and supporters and users to become owners of it?
Yeah, that's a great question. It was something that was asked a lot in 2016-17. I and some friends did a campaign where we called for Twitter to become community owned, or to explore strategies for community ownership. We had enough stock to be able to do a shareholder proposal, and a lot of people just said, why do that? You can always just, even the company said, you can always just buy our stock. But actually, when you, again, look at the rules of the game, when you become a shareholder, our regulatory environment is designed to ensure that your interest in that company is purely financial. You're only, everything about the structure of the relationship is that you're trying to make as much money as possible, and that company has to make you as much money as possible. Whereas the forms of community ownership that we're talking about here, and this is a broader family now, it includes cooperatives, but also you could look at trust-based ownership structures, or even kind of membership nonprofits. There's a broad range of possibilities here. And many of these actually broaden the relationship. They say, this company, sure, there's a fiduciary responsibility, but there's also a kind of democratic right where the company is now responsible to its members, not just to make them more money, but actually to treat them fairly, to reflect their values, and they can have a voice in that company in many of these contexts. So by framing, community is a very broad and squishy word, and I know that the imprecision is intentional. The idea here, though, is to look at the models that move us from a purely kind of financial relationship, which has its role, but is really, I would argue, insufficient for managing these great utilities of our time, toward a recognition, which is the language that many of these companies use themselves already anyway, that their users are a community and should be treated as such.
So you're starting to stray into language that I've heard from other folks who are big fans of B corporations and sort of other ways of making a structural change to investment vehicles that they see as freeing these structures from a particular dictate, which is to make as much return for investors as possible. There's a counter argument that that's a misreading of what the corporate responsibilities actually are, that corporations, including publicly traded ones, for years have made decisions that are in community interest, that are values aligned, that are not purely profit aligned. Your argument about exiting to community seems to center on this idea, or at least in that explanation, seems to center on this idea that ownership through equity doesn't give control proportional towards the ownership, right? That essentially it's giving you fiscal ownership, but not necessarily controlling ownership. If that system were reformed and you had proportional control in a company based on your financial share, would that solve these problems? Or are you talking about something that's sort of deeper and more complex here?
Well, so you're absolutely right that there is a sense in which these in which what we're talking about here, like the responsibility of shareholder primacy and profit maximization is in many respects as cultural as it is legal. But when you do look at these documents and sign these documents and explore how, for instance, companies speak to their shareholders and the kinds of language that shareholders use.
Culture is real. Yeah,
it's very real.
Just because it's cultural doesn't mean that it's not powerful.
And the incentive is baked in. I mean, you really do stand to benefit in a certain way from the company when you are a shareholder, and when you're a large shareholder, this is what they're interested in. But in terms of the specific reforms, I think there are a lot of strategies for how to do this and how to meet these kinds of goals. And you see this in terms of the breadth of what earlier generations have done. I really try to focus on the fact that this is not a matter of inventing the new model often, right? The B Corp or whatever, right? A lot of what B Corps are trying to propose, are things that cooperatives have been doing for, over a century with much more teeth, B Corps, it's still not really clear whether this stuff is legally enforceable, but it is a powerful signaling mechanism, and signaling is really important. But when you do create structures, like for instance, one approach to exit to community that folks have been exploring is using purpose trusts, where you're able to, kind of similar to a B Corp, inscribe a limitation or a positive affirmation of purpose in the corporate governance of an organization. That can change some of the incentive structures. Cooperatives, their financial incentives are very different often from shareholders in a public company. They're not buying and selling shares left and right. They're attaching their relationship to a commitment, to loyalty, to a different kind of time horizon, and that changes how you relate to that share. It is not simply a commodity. It's a relationship. It's a commitment. It's it's a long-term bond, and that kind of temporal relationship is something that I think is really interesting to explore. So I don't think there is one solution to these problems we're talking about. But what is important to emphasize is that the solution space, the responses based on traditions and experience of what has worked in the past, are largely unavailable in the online economy because of the environment that we've established, both regulatory and then based on that cultural. You can't walk into an accelerator, a mainstream accelerator, other than Start.coop, the one I co-founded, right, and say I want to, I really want to learn about how to build this business model, but I'd like to do it as a cooperative someday. You'll be laughed out of the room. The models just are not even available.
It is really interesting to think about how culture does come into play here, right? So a lot of my work these days is with public media organizations, particularly in Europe. And these are organizations that are surprisingly powerful compared to public media as we think of it in the United States. And they are a very particular sort of organization. They're not governmental in the sense that we think of them. They actually have an enormous amount of independence. But they are values-led organizations. They have a specific charter of values, and they have to live up to that chartered purpose, which often has to do with things like ensuring the privacy and autonomy of their users and working on the diversity of points of view. And then weirdly enough, those values come into very sharp conflict with the realities of the software world, for instance, right? Is it possible to be an organization that is supporting the privacy and the autonomy of your users and then pushing them onto Facebook to have a conversation about your programming? But in Europe, at least, the notion of reasonably powerful and innovative entities that are not governed by traditional, we must make a venture capital return in sort of a fixed amount of time, it feels like another tool in the toolbox in addition to co-ops, B Corps, so on and so forth. But I want to push this in a very different direction because we've somehow managed to talk about different models for innovation, different structures for organizations for 40 minutes without mentioning cryptocurrency or DAOs. Are distributed autonomous organizations part of the solution set within all of this. We're having this conversation at a very strange moment in time where many people heard the word DAO for the first time when a group of people raised $40 million in the hopes of buying the US Constitution. Is this part of the solution set, or is this just a terrible distraction from the very real problems that you're trying to solve?
Well, when I was on my book tour for my my book about Occupy Wall Street in early 2014, I made a stop in San Francisco, and at the time I was trying to figure out what was the next phase of this, what I had experienced as a democracy movement around the world in 2011, where young people everywhere from Egypt to Lower Manhattan were experimenting with radical, deepening approaches to democracy, trying to reimagine what democracy needs to be in a networked era, and two threads came before me. I was already following some of those Occupy movement folks into worker cooperatives and into this old cooperative tradition, but at the same time in San Francisco, this friend came to me and said, hey, there's this thing you really need to know about. This white paper just came out, and this was the Ethereum white paper. And I'd heard about Bitcoin a lot and Occupy, and I'm not, like a gold bug. I'm not, I don't think the Federal Reserve is the biggest problem in the world. And I was just not very interested in this weird kind of money. But Ethereum was different. That was a tool where maybe those same experiments could continue through the kinds of organizations that people would be able to build out of smart contracts, really building organizational experiments, from the ground up without having to, have a new incorporation statute. And so, I started reporting on that back at a time when I couldn't get any, any of my editors at magazines and papers to care. So I was hanging around this group and, saw the ambivalence of that space, some really scary dystopian stuff about, how we're going to turn everything into a commodity and so forth, but also that kind of vision of this is a space where we can build the deeply accountable institutions that, that these movements were craving. And, now we're just getting to the point where those possibilities are starting to become very, very real very quickly. And so, in some of my recent work, I've been following the governance designs in DAOs, in these autonomous organizations. And some of it, I think, is this kind of dystopia of a financial sector without an economy. But in some of it, you see people, inventing new voting mechanisms every week. You see a level of creativity and innovation about human self-governance that I see almost nowhere else. And so I think, there is this kind of deep possibility in some of these communities forming around blockchain technology, but everything depends on the choices that are being made right now.
We had a good conversation on the podcast with Maciej Szydłowski, who is, like me, old enough to have seen a lot of things and be cynical about almost everything. And he had cautionary words for me about Web3, which was that he was paying attention to it because he saw creativity and energy around the movement in ways that he wasn't seeing around the rest of the web. That Web 2.0, as it got swallowed by Facebook and sort of other massive platform companies, had really squeezed the fun out of it. But the folks who are playing around with NFTs and DAOs actually seem to be engaged in, the sort of play that has been so important to the creation of the web over time. And so I'm trying to take that creativity around voting and such very seriously. But it does feel like a moment to actually sort of look at the space. We did see this attempt to organize a group of people to buy a copy of the US Constitution and put it on display. They never actually used the governance parts of the DAO. So they never actually decided where the Constitution would go, how it would end up being used. They hit a fairly predictable problem, which is since they stated the amount of money they were willing to bid on the Constitution, someone outbid them. And then people wanted to do something the DAO promised that they could do, which was back out of it and pull their money out. And in the process, they discovered that the transaction fees on Ethereum were so much that for the average user, they were wiped out in the process of doing it. Put all that aside, and put aside the fact that they burned some phenomenal amount of carbon in the process of doing all of that. Even if that DEO worked the way that it was supposed to, isn't it ultimately based around this idea of one token, one vote? Is there not a sense in which the emergence of these tokenized democracies, are these not the scariest technologies for inequality that we've seen in the last 20 plus years?
Well, from the beginning, I have heard from boosters of these technologies that this is going to, unlock the global south. This is going to bank the unbanked. And that never happens. And, often it's a bunch of privileged folks getting richer. So I share the cynicism, and I think it's a reminder that with these new technologies are more likely to amplify the inequalities and the injustices of a society than to undo them. And we need to be really attentive to that. There are, you always see in these generative moments, though, those paths that we could go down. For instance, addressing that question of like plutocracy in voting. A lot of these new kind of decision-making models that folks are exploring here attempt to address just that. So one example is quadratic voting, where the more tokens you stake, the less the value each one has in the vote, and small voters have more power collectively. Another approach is one called conviction voting, where the more time you stake your vote, the more it's worth. These are things that are often really just not available, and not even kind of they don't come to mind in other kinds of contexts. And these kinds of things are being invented all the time again. And so that kind of froth is super exciting. But what we have to be very aware of, and what I think is kind of the Achilles heel of Web3 as with Web2, is this belief that decentralized technology produces decentralized social outcomes. And, we saw that with the growth of Web 2, where, there's this great line in Tim Berners-Lee's 1999 memoir where he talks about how no company can ever take control of this because it's decentralized. And, we know how that turned out, and so does he. And Web 3, when you look at the power of protocols compared to platforms, the way in which protocols have this incredible hegemony, that there is actually the potential for more centralized power to form on these technologies than the world has ever seen. And that's why Facebook wants it. They know that. So we need to, I've argued, for instance, that we need to, as in antitrust law, for instance, create forms of accountable centralization in order to protect the kinds of decentralization we want. We need to intentionally create the social structures that protect against accumulations of power, rather than assuming, as I think far too many people in the kind of Web3 space do right now, that technologies that appear to be structurally decentralized are going to produce decentralized outcomes. I think there's a lot of reason to think that's not the case. And already, one example, just real quick, is of a regulatory intervention. Actually, as much as these folks despise the government often, the SEC ruled that in order to get a securities exemption, a kind of a safe harbor, these protocols have to be what they call sufficiently decentralized. So this has forced a lot, this centralized rule has forced a lot of these token systems to actually decentralize their ownership. And it's these kinds of interventions that I think we need to start taking seriously and recognize that, that decentralization is not just a technical phenomenon, it's also a social and economic one.
I think this is a really hard reality for some fans of decentralization to accept, which is that you might need these centralized regulatory authorities to make decentralization possible in meaningful ways. One of the interesting things about the early story of Bitcoin was watching this impossibly decentralized technology that couldn't be controlled by anyone suddenly controlled by about 4 Chinese mining pools.
That's right.
And very reasonable questions about whether those pools in collusion had the possibility of a 51% attack, which would functionally control the value of that currency and be able to avoid transactions at that point. I think what's an interesting challenge for me on all of this is you are thinking very hard about how to reorder the space of innovation. A lot of the ideas that you put on the table that sound the most practical come down to regulatory changes like ways to create pools of capital for shared ownership. And those feel like the sort of things that are going to have to go through our centralized and, by the way, highly dysfunctional and somewhat paralyzed government system. What are the projects that you are most hopeful about at the moment, given those real constraints, given the fact that it is incredibly hard right now to accomplish anything at the federal level? What do you look at from the regulatory point of view? What do you look at from the creative financial point of view? What's the project that you sort of look towards that gives you hope for this notion of capital for innovation that isn't coming out so much of the venture community, but is really coming out of cooperative and collective power?
Well, I think it has to happen at a lot of levels. And you're absolutely right. I mean, we don't have the kind of political will to say, oh, this is a great idea, let's do it, right? It's getting simple, good ideas through in our current environment is very hard. And I think there's an interesting opportunity for a dynamic relationship between some of these new spaces that are emerging. I mean, I am of a bit of a kind of techno-utopian in the sense that I think that technology is creating an opportunity for us to have levels of governance that go beyond the territorial nation state. I think nation states are still going to be, should be important for territorial things, but we are creating potentially new governance layers. And so when I say, we need to start thinking about, regulatory intervention, like in the crypto space. Sure, the SEC, I think, has done a really helpful thing with that idea. But actually, something like the Ethereum protocol could also have that same rule built into it, and it could actually be enforced more powerfully. It becomes a kind of transnational governance layer. It could, and actually already is. I've had conversations, for instance, with people developing the future of the Ethereum protocol on how to create public goods funding out of that. So some of the new layers being developed right now, they're recognizing, based on their mistakes with the first version, that we need to build in a public goods funding layer at the core of the new pieces that are being introduced into the system, and those are being designed in a way that is much more kind of collective ownership compatible than, for instance, venture capital. So this can be done with some of these technologies. So when I talk about kind of the regulatory and political conversations we need to be having, I think those can be had both in kind of meat space legal environments, as well as in some of these new emerging protocols, which are themselves emerging governance layers. There are of course lots of more local strategies. So for instance, here in Colorado, many U.S. platform co-ops are incorporating here because we have really flexible co-op laws. We have a state government that's super supportive and has created lending pools and has started doing things it can at the state level to encourage this stuff. And now even we're seeing DAOs incorporate as tokenized cooperatives here in Colorado because of that, even that very local recognition and innovation. So I think the answer to that question is multiple sides, but I do think we need to start, as Lawrence Lessig argued long ago, right? Recognize that code is law, particularly in these smart contract environments. And I've been trying to encourage the designers of these systems to think of themselves not simply as designing economic structures, but political structures as well, and to kind of get used to that.
Well, Nathan, I'm really glad to hear that someone is standing up for public goods and making the case for collective ownership and collective benefit in a world that so often seems like it's tied up with casino economics and the hopes that we're all going to get rich off of bored apes. What a delightful conversation. We've really covered all over the map. Nathan Schneider, thank you so much for being with us today.
It's such a pleasure. Thank you.